wrote a column after the election saying, like, you need to go with the Republicans can potentially win here, but they have to go with like the Massachusetts, Maryland Republican governor route, where, you know, a kind of pro-business but humane, socially moderate kind of guy or woman, but they have no interest in that. They want to be crazy.
Yeah. And that's kind of a national problem as well, that these candidates who can get through the primaries are not the ones that can win in the general. And it seems to be kind of a systemic problem with the GOP these days. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aaron Rupar Show. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by J. Patrick Coolican. Patrick is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, and so we get deep on what's going on in state politics here. Longtime followers of my work may know that I cut my teeth in journalism covering Minnesota politics for the City Pages, an alt weekly that no longer exists, but lives on in a little bit of the spirit of the Minnesota Reformer, which does some of that same sort of coverage in terms of having some progressive values and some voice about what's happening in the state. And I also think, you know, for listeners, viewers, followers who may not be in Minnesota, that Minnesota is kind of an interesting case study right now in terms of what Democrats can do when they have power. Here in the state, Democrats control the House, Senate, and the governor's mansion right now for the first time in quite some time. And they've been using that power to pass a lot of progressive legislation, everything ranging from marijuana legalization, which is happening right now. There's actually votes just this week happening that will set the stage for shops to open selling THC products next year, to free school lunches was passed this year. There's a push right now to have a constitutional amendment for abortion rights that would be on the ballot next year. So even if you're not immersed in Minnesota politics or following it super close, I think, you know, some of the things that are happening here are of interest in other states that have a Democratic trifecta, or, you know, that may have one soon, in terms of what possibilities that unlocks. So I hope you enjoy that conversation that I have with Patrick coming up. A couple of housekeeping notes. Next week, I will have Oliver Willis on the podcast with me, longtime progressive blogger and journalist. And so we'll talk more national politics with him next week. And if you're listening to this, you're listening to it either on Thursday or later, because I am dropping this episode of the show on Thursday morning. A little bit of a change up from the usual Wednesday evening schedule that I've been on. And that will also be the case with next week's podcast as well. I'm going to see how it goes, publishing these first thing in the morning instead of later in the evening when people are kind of logged off their computers. But let me know if you have thoughts either way on that. New episodes of the pod drop every Thursday. If you're listening to this, great, please subscribe. I also post the footage of the interviews on YouTube, so please subscribe to my YouTube page if you haven't already, and like the podcast that you are watching. Without further ado, let's get to my interview with J. Patrick Coolican. All right, welcome to the Aaron Rupar Show. Today, I am really excited to be joined by J. Patrick Coolican. Patrick is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, which is an independent publication doing really excellent coverage of Minnesota politics, policy. It's a really good read if you're interested in either of those things as it pertains to Minnesota. And, you know, obviously, as I was telling Patrick before we started recording, most of the podcasts I do and most of the coverage I do in Public Notice pertains to more national issues, national politics, but I think Minnesota makes for kind of an interesting test case right now of what Democrats are doing in states where they have a trifecta, as they do here and in Michigan. And, you know, it's a state that has a reputation for being kind of purplish in politics, but in fact, a Republican in Minnesota has not won a statewide in almost 20 years. You have to go back to Tim Pawlenty all the way back in 2006 was the last statewide victory. And I think, you know, there are some issues happening in the Minnesota Republican Party that in part account for that. So we'll get into that as well. So Patrick, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Yeah, and just by way of context here, so some of the viewers and listeners might be aware that I actually covered Minnesota politics from 2011 through 14 for the City Pages, RIP. It was an alt weekly that existed here in the Twin Cities and was purchased ultimately by the Star Tribune, which, Patrick, actually, I know you were a reporter there for many years covering state politics. So a little bit of irony there, I suppose. But the first cycle that I covered, I think, kind of sets the stage nicely for some of what we'll talk about today, because I remember in the 2012 cycle, at that time, Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate here. And that year was a big deal politically here in Minnesota because Republicans tried to pass both a marriage amendment banning same-sex marriage and voter ID through a referendum. And these ballot measures ended up backfiring spectacularly, where Republicans ended up losing both the House and the Senate that year, and kind of set the stage for the decade that was to come, where Republicans have controlled the Senate in Minnesota for periods of time, but they haven't had both chambers of the legislature. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but I believe they haven't had both simultaneously since then, nor obviously have they had the governor's mansion. So what are your memories, I guess, just to maybe start there, of that election cycle? I think you were already at the Strip at that point, but
I was not here in 12.
Okay.
But I came in 14, and so I was kind of figured out. I got steeped in that 12 election because it was such a big deal. And I think, what happened was that the Republicans, and this is an ongoing theme here in Minnesota, at least, is that they just kind of failed to read the room.
Mm.
They thought that they were going to do what happened in Wisconsin. They thought they could replicate that, and what they didn't realize is just the electorate is just much different here, and there's a strong progressive tradition here that people want to defend, and so there's just a lot of important distinctions, differences about Minnesota politics that they've misread, and they continue to misread up to this day. They have had some success. They did take the House and Senate in the 16, the kind of crazy 16 election, but they lost the House in 18, and then lost the Senate narrowly in 22. So that sets up the trifecta now.
What's your sense if, as it seems increasingly likely it will be, if Trump ends up being again the Republican nominee next year? How do you think that will go in Minnesota? Because, for listeners who might not follow Minnesota politics as closely as I do or Patrick does, Trump lost the caucuses in 2016 here to Rubio, which ended up being, I think, one of only two places that Rubio won the Republican primary or caucus, and the other being Washington, D.C. But then, Trump almost beats Hillary Clinton. I think it came down to 1.5 percentage points. It was too close for comfort for sure. And then, 2020, Biden won fairly comfortably here. But how, for Democrats here, how concerning do you think the prospect of Trump being at the top of the ticket would be? I mean, do you feel like, this being his third time around and Minnesota not being an exceptionally Trumpy state by any means, that this would again be fairly easy pickings for Biden? Or, maybe I'm not reading the room correctly on this one.
Yeah, he actually, Trump came close in 2016. He lost by 44,000 votes, which is a small number. But the one major factor was that a lot of votes went to the third party, or minor party candidates, and I think in retrospect that's attributed to the fact that Hillary Clinton did not run a good campaign, wasn't a particularly good candidate, and so then Trump, he thought for sure that he could actually flip Minnesota. He'd be the first Republican to win here since Richard Nixon. And he wound up expending a lot of resources and time here. We're pretty sure he got COVID here, actually.
That's right. Up in Duluth, I believe it was. Yeah.
And in retrospect, it was just a total waste. He lost by a comfortable margin. It was very similar to 2012, Obama's victory.
It was such a comfortable margin that Trump didn't even try to overthrow the result here like he did in Michigan and Pennsylvania, where it was a little closer. Yeah,
exactly. Although some Republican activists continue to bang on about how the election was fixed. I mean, and this is part of their problem. I mean, it's the average Minnesotan just looks at that and just it's just not credible. And I think that you're from Minnesota, so I think you have a good sense of this, that Minnesotans tend to be kind of a small C conservative, and or there's something about like the Midwestern demeanor and character, and Donald Trump is a bad fit for that.
Yeah.
He's all over the place. He's just not someone that, I mean, Minnesotans don't invite people to their homes in general, but certainly they would not invite this New York kind of flashy guy who was always, banging around about everything. And he's just not a good fit for here. So it was kind of always a quixotic effort on his part in his campaigns. And I think it probably backfired.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to highlight a story that was in the Reformer that I think kind of illustrates some of the problems with the Republican Party here. And it was a pretty fascinating read. I believe you guys published this last week about a state senator named Nathan Weisenberg. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I believe
It's Wiesenberg.
Wiesenberg.
Yeah.
Okay. It was from an outstate area, Little Falls, for people who might know the state a little bit. But he had a meeting in his office last week with a group of school teachers who were actually from his district and ended up kind of going ballistic on them, accusing them of using library books to, quote, teach boys how to give blowjobs, end quote. And, this meeting ended with, kind of an explosive confrontation, it sounded like. But, this isn't necessarily an isolated case. I kind of had a little cottage industry going this legislative session of posting clips of Steve Dryskowski, who's another state senator who's a Republican, not necessarily saying anything that kind of crazed, but doing things like denying child hunger is a thing, characterizing white people as being victims of genocide and kind of things of that nature. I kind of swoop in when I read articles like that or see clips that I post like these Drazkowski clips, but how emblematic of the broader state of the Republican Party in Minnesota are scenes like that? I mean, is this, are these guys kind of the exception? Is there a faction of the Republican Party in the state that is more kind of normal and rational, or, is the crazy kind of part of the DNA at this point?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is that they use this caucus process, which is a longstanding tradition in this state and many others, and so who's going to gather on a Saturday and spend 8 hours battling it out in some caucus to determine who the endorsed candidate of the Republican Party is? Well, it's going to be kind of the most frankly off balance activists. And so you wind up with this really hardcore right wing folks coming out of the most conservative districts. And like you said, you have a kind of a cottage industry. I mean, they have, impressive list just this session of viral self-owns, I guess I would call it, standing up on the floor of the House of the Senate and saying just crazy things that nobody believes except them and their small little crew. But they're a force in both the House and Senate caucus. A bunch of them moved over from the House to the Senate. And I think that they, in the case of Grodowski, I think he's got a significant mailing list, and for him, these are actually viral hits that he's using to raise money. So I mean, it's sort of the pathology of American politics right now. And it's mostly on one side, of course. But yeah, I think the problem is that they do have there is a normal Republican here, the kind who backed Marco Rubio, for instance, like you mentioned in 2016. But there aren't enough of them, and they also just have this procedural. They have this process that really gives an advantage to the radicals in the party.
Mm. Yeah, speaking of normal Republicans, maybe a good place to go is something that is really in the news in Minnesota right now, which is marijuana legislation that I believe allows for commercial sale. Ultimately, that we were talking just before going live here, went through the House yesterday. You said that the Senate version is a little bit different, so there's going to have to be a conference committee to resolve those differences before it goes to the governor's desk. But give me kind of the broad outlines of what this legislation would do. And I do understand, and I guess there already have been votes on this, that some Republicans do support this as well. So what's kind of the state of play with this legislation?
Yeah, so it passed the House yesterday with a couple Republican votes. There was one Democrat who voted against it. I'm not sure what the whip count is in the Senate, but I'm pretty sure they would not be bringing it to the floor without majority support. And it will. I think it'll be its own. Minnesota is going to do its own thing on this issue, as we often do. But you are going to see dispensaries. There's going to be a kind of statewide regulatory structure. You're going to be able to grow a few of your own plants and purchase up to 2 ounces, I think, of flour and a certain amount of milligrams of THC. So it'll be similar to some other states. The taxes are a little lower. But yeah, it's happening. And what's remarkable is, I mean, I'm not from Minnesota, so when the idea was tossed around originally, I think it was pretty late in the game. It was 2017, as I remember, there being some fairly high profile bills, but Democrats didn't have control of either chamber. So it was kind of like laughed at by people around the Capitol. And, my thinking was like, you have no idea. Like, the public is behind this. Mm-hmm. And like, this is happening eventually. So it did take a little bit longer just because they couldn't get control of the legislature. But as soon as they did, they were ready to go. The House had passed the bill in 21, I think. But there was a Republican Senate that didn't even take a vote on it. So yeah, it's here, and it's just one of a long list of legislative accomplishments that they had. They really were ready to go on day one. I will give them credit for that, and that's why they've been so productive this session.
Yeah, and I jotted down a few of them. The trifecta this session has passed legislation protecting trans rights, abortion rights. They passed legislation for free school lunches. There was even a tax cut bill, right, that I believe there's essentially going to be rebate checks going back to taxpayers. Is Tim Walz, the governor, Tim Walz, is his name going to be on those checks? I saw a little bit of debate over how much ownership he was going to take of these rebate checks.
Yeah, that was his re-election campaign. I mean, it was clearly political more than policy oriented, but the OAS sitting on a big surplus, and so you wanted to call them Walz checks. And the Republicans during the camp, this is last year when they still had the Senate, and we're not going to call them Walz checks. And, it was foolish because it just made us all talk more about these Walz checks. And,
right.
Sure, let's have a debate about what we're going to call this money that we're going to send to voters. Walz ended up winning, relatively comfortably his re-election campaign. So, yeah, there's going to be rebate checks. There's going to be a child tax credit. There's going to be probably something to help people with childcare. It's a huge issue here, like in a lot of places, but it's extremely expensive here, as you and I probably both know.
Yeah.
And there's one particularly bad policy that I don't like. They're going to eliminate or reduce state tax on Social Security benefits, which is basically, there was a couple of swing state Democrats who ran on that issue. And so now they're kind of like, they backed themselves into a corner on that. But, this is going to be a pretty good tax bill. And then there's going to be a big bump in education spending. There's all kinds of good stuff, and they're lucky that they have this. I mean, they got the trifecta and this big surplus, so it's just a great moment for progressive policymaking here.
Yeah, and is there a faction of Republicans that are supporting any of these, these policy items that we just ticked through there, or is it still pretty polarized in the sense that Democrats are supporting the stuff, Republicans are against it? I do understand with some of the tax cuts that it was like a demand Republicans had to support other parts of the legislative agenda that Walz and Democrats have. But, I guess I'm just curious if there is kind of a middle ground here where there is, sort of centrist Republicans or Democrats that are swing votes on some of these items.
Not much. There is in the Senate, it's 34-33. So there have been some interesting amendments that Republicans have grabbed a Democrat or two. And but for the most part, it's polarized like elsewhere. There are some issues like, driver's licenses for people who are undocumented. That was advocated. There were Republicans who were advocating for that in previous sessions. I'm not sure they actually voted for it this time, but it passed. And it was helpful that it had been an idea that had been backed by Republicans in the past. There was another one where we're restoring voting rights to people who are their term of incarceration is over, but they're still under state supervision, like probation, parole. That had also won some Republican support in the past. So it's helpful when you can, and those both passed. So you go out and you can say, well, these are bipartisan ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to back up just for a second on the marijuana issue because people may or may not remember that there was a certain degree of legalization that was passed last year when Democrats basically snuck it into a larger omnibus bill that a number of Republicans, I guess, just didn't read or didn't understand what was in it, ended up voting for it. This was before they had the trifecta, so you needed some Republican votes to get this done. So there's kind of a weird situation here in the state now where, for instance, there's a liquor store across the street from me that for a time had a whole rack of THC seltzers. And I went in there one day and the seltzers were gone. They sold the shelving up and I asked what was going on. And the clerk said that they took them down because they had heard that, inspectors were coming in and finding some of these places because apparently liquor stores weren't supposed to sell these in quantity. Like they weren't supposed to sell a 4-pack or 6-pack. They could sell them in a fridge individually, but not apparently, as a 4-pack or a 6-pack. But that, he said, I have them in the back if you want one. So, it seems like it's kind of the Wild West a little bit. And I guess my question is, well, one other tidbit on this before I get to my question is that, so the law, as I understand it, is that you can have up to, there's a certain milligram that you can have per container, basically. But the thing that I've noticed is that now with some of these seltzers, they are selling like 16-ounce seltzer waters that are like 20 milligrams, which is a very high dose. I mean, this would be like kind of drinking like a 16-ounce bourbon or something, like it's not a light drink by any means. But if you read the packaging, it says that it's supposed to be 4 servings. So the idea is that you buy one of these seltzers, you divvy it up into 4 servings. Nobody actually does this with seltzer water, I don't think, or most people don't. But, I was just kind of thinking as I was looking at some of these products that I could see it being kind of a political landmine, not to mention the possible human toll. But, if someone grabbed one of these and, had one and then got behind the wheel or something like that, I mean, I could see it being really bad politics, given kind of the loose regulation of these products. So has that been a topic at the Capitol at all this year? Like I said, it feels kind of like the Wild West and sort of unregulated for products that can be dangerous. I'm just curious if there's been any kind of fallout from that.
Yeah, I was actually very concerned about this when they snuck it in. I mean, it was legislative mastery on the part of the then Majority Leader Ryan Winkler. And there's this great moment when the Senate is passing this amendment. And what they intended to do was to regulate this kind of off-brand thing called Delta 8.
It's Delta 8 and 9, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't remember which is the THC we're used to offhand. But anyway, they said, okay, we need to regulate this stuff because it was like in this legal gray area that goes back to the 2017, I think, federal farm bill or 2018, I can't remember. And so there's this legal gray area and everybody's selling this Delta 8 or 9, I can't remember. But and say, so, okay, let's set up regulations on cannabinoids. And okay, we want to do that. Okay. But what they didn't realize, what the Senate Republicans didn't realize, was that by doing so, they were de facto making it legal because you're regulating it.
Yeah.
And there's this great moment in they passed the debate, and Jim Abler, the state senator, Republican from the North Metro, says, "We didn't just legalize marijuana, did we?" And the Democrats on the conference committee are laughing. "Oh, no, you didn't do that." And sure enough, they did. And so the problem was that, it was very light regulation. It was childproof packaging. It had to be 5 milligrams only, like low dose, and you could only have 100. Gummies were 100. You could only sell a certain amount at a time, and it was 5 milligrams per gummy. But you said that, as you mentioned, they kind of would mess around with the serving size. They didn't really have any. They put this in the hands of the state pharmacy board, who regulate, there's only like 25 of them who work for that board. They regulate pharmacists and pharmacies. Mm-hmm. And I called the executive director and she's like, "We don't do this. Like, we don't really know what So I had a lot of fears that there were going to be all these horror stories, like right on the eve of the election or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to be like a reefer madness situation. Um, there's been a little bit of that, but really not that much. And I think the low dose thing has been really helpful in that.
Yeah.
You mentioned how there's been some regulatory arbitrage around that, but I think in general, it's been um, low dose, lower risk. And so we have, and maybe there are horror stories happening. We're just not aware of them, but I feel like we would be. The other great thing is it put the foot in the door, and there was really no going back because you have all these retailers, and any retail shop, you don't need a license. Any retail shop can sell them. So now they're all making money off this, and they would form a concerted lobby if you tried to undo it. And then you've got the hemp farmers who are, who are now a good, powerful lobby. So once you did that, there's really no going back. And it was just a matter of like, okay, well, now we have it. Like now we should regulate it and go full bore. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where we are.
And I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when you mentioned full bore and having, more kind of like shops that actually sell THC products, I mean, which already exists, but, more in the sense of smokable products, things like that. Was this part of the political planning here, that I think these are going to be rolling out like next summer, kind of ahead of the 2024 elections? Is that timing correct? And do you think that there was maybe a little bit of a thought of, well, this wouldn't be so bad if in the fall of 2024, all of these storefronts are opening around the state?
Yeah, I mean that's what Zach Stevenson, the author of the bills, he says that we should see dispensaries open next summer, and that's certainly going to be good for you would think DFL turnout, especially with young voters. The other thing they're probably going to do is put an abortion constitutional amendment on the ballot, and that's likely to drive turnout amongst important DFL groups.
Yeah, because that was a big story a few months ago, that the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled that there is a right in the state constitution to abortion care. This is actually, I've covered this in my newsletter, that in a lot of red states, this has been the path that people are trying to take at this point to codify some form of abortion rights, is going through the state Supreme Courts. It was a little bit different in Minnesota because I don't think there was ever there wasn't a political threat, in the sense that by the time this ruling came down, I think Democrats already had a trifecta. So it wasn't as though, Republicans were agitating to pass some sort of abortion ban as they are in other states. But so there is this ruling that there is a constitutional right to an abortion, but a constitutional amendment would go even a step further and, kind of have the voters affirm that. Is that basically how that? Yeah.
Well, your timeline's a little off. So there's a case from the 90s that serves as our own Roe v. Wade. And then there was another case, but despite the Roe v. Wade, there had been, because there was quite a few anti-abortion Democrats through the years until recently. And so there were a number of restrictions. Minnesota was basically sort of down the middle state on abortion rights. There was a lawsuit seeking to overturn a lot of those restrictions. And right after Dobbs came down, the state judge threw out a lot of the restrictions. So Minnesota became pretty libertarian on abortion rights. And then the election, I think when you talk to Democrats, they say abortion was really a deciding issue, especially in the suburbs, but also in, some of those outstate regional centers, Moorhead and Mankato and so forth. It was a key issue. And, I just think that there's now a pro-choice majority here, and just by keeping it in the conversation, it's smart for Democrats because again, you have this kind of radical right Republicans, and you get them talking about abortion, and they're bound to say some crazy things that scares everybody, so we're on our way to being, I think, one of the more libertarian states in the country, and really kind of an island in the upper Midwest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talked about a number of the things that Democrats have been accomplishing this particular legislative session. Are you at all surprised that Democrats have been able to stay so united in terms of getting all of this legislation done, or was that kind of baked in, after the election happened?
I am a little surprised because with this 34-33 state Senate, and
Right.
there's a guy named John Hoffman, who I immediately figured was going to be the Joe Manchin of the session, and he has crossed over a few times, but I think there's just there's significant pressure that this is what we've been waiting for a long time. We've been working on these progressive policies, but not able to get them passed, and now's the time. And so, I mean, another big one was the 2040 plan, which is to decarbonize electricity generation here. So yeah, I mean, all the stuff that they've been wanting to do, it's like, okay, now's the time to do it. We might not get this opportunity again. So let's get to work. And I mean, I've been surprised because I did think that there was going to be more, at least the need for horse trading with these members. In a 34-33 Senate, you have a lot of leverage.
Mm-hmm. Are they leaving any agenda items for next year at this point? I mean, they're gonna have one more session before the next election. It seems like they're getting a great deal done right now, but what's going to be left for next time around?
Well, I was joking yesterday to my staff that they're going to have to come back and fix a bunch of their screw ups this session. I mean, when you're working at this pace that they have, there's bound to be kind of unintended consequences and mistakes. But the one issue that I think is, I'm afraid, I'm not sure the status is, and that's gun control. There are two bills alive. There's a red flag law and a universal background checks law. Again, with that 34-33 Senate, where you've got some outstate members, Moorhead, and there's a guy from Kermantown, and they literally won't. You ask them and they won't tell you. They say they're still studying the issue and so forth. So it's in a House bill that passed, a big omnibus. I'm unsure about the Senate, and so I think that's a question. And Governor Tim Walz, who, by the way, used to have an A rating from the NRA when he was in Congress, but he's come around on that issue a big time. He's pushing that hard. I've noticed they had a rally yesterday. Gwen Walz was there. So that indicates to me they might be a little concerned that they don't have the votes yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually, I should mention that Walz yesterday, I noticed, was tweeting about the red flag law, which he obviously supports. He's been very, and again, I don't follow this as closely as you do, so correct me if some of my if I have some misconceptions here, but it seems like he is governed in a quite progressive manner overall. And, if you go back to the previous governor, Mark Dayton, before Walz, one of Dayton's bugaboos was that he was very anti-marijuana. And I remember that being, there were even some Republicans back, I was at City Pages, who supported loosening restrictions on marijuana, whether it be medical, but they could never get anything done because Dayton, basically even with medical was mostly opposed to it. But Walz, as you mentioned, who, used to have an A rating from the NRA, he was a member of Congress from southern Minnesota district that's pretty rural. It seems like he's evolved quite a bit in his current office. Did that take you, you're all surprised by that he's kind of governed as a, firmly to the left of center Democrat instead of a more moderate?
I'm not super surprised because I got to know him on the 28 campaign, and I mean, and my feeling was that he was a politically shrewd guy who understand what it took to win in that congressional district, the first district, which is all of southern Minnesota from Wisconsin to South Dakota border. So there's a lot of agricultural interests, and he was really good on that issue. He was, he's a veteran himself of the 24 years in the National Guard. So he was a football coach. So a lot of it was more persona than actual policy. And, when I would talk to Gwen Walz, his wife, who's very influential, I think, and it's a political partnership, you really got the sense of where their head was at when it came to policy. So, there's some issues where he's been, I think, disappointing to progressives. There's, as Minneapolis and then Brooklyn Center went through a lot with police killings of folks. And Walz was, especially in the case of Dante Wright's killing, in the aftermath, he was really committed to the fact that they were not going to burn down that police station in Brooklyn Center, and that meant some pretty harsh tactics. And this really alienated a lot of progressive activists. But in general, if you look at the scoreboard, yeah, you're right. He's definitely been a progressive governor. And on that marijuana issue in particular, Mark Dayton had a history of substance abuse, and I think that probably colored his thinking on that. But it was a huge defeat, at least on that issue. That Mark Dayton was there for 8 years, and he would just never consider it.
Right.
And Tim Walz ran in 18, saying he'd signed something on it.
Yeah, a couple quick things here before I get you out of here. One that I wanted to kind of circle back to is the Republican Party's candidate quality issue. You mentioned earlier that Walz won relatively easily last year. Well, part of the reason for that was you had Scott Jensen as a Republican candidate against him, who was this kind of quack anti-vax doctor, and then his lieutenant governor candidate was Matt Burke, a former NFL player who I think Republicans wanted him to run for office for many, many years because he had that sort of celebrity, being a local guy who played for the Vikings, Harvard educated. But he just seemed to have a penchant for, like you kind of put it earlier, the viral cell phones. He, especially on the abortion issue, he even had some comments, I remember, opposing abortion even in cases of rape and things like that. So it just wasn't a very good ticket. But this has kind of been the thing for a long time with the Republican Party. I mean, you had Jeff Johnson running against Walz the previous time, who was kind of this generic white guy with no charisma. And that seems to be, the generic white guy with no charisma seems to be kind of the best that Republicans have been able to do, going back like a decade now. So I think next year, the only statewide office on the ballot is Tina Smith's Senate seat. But are there any Republicans you kind of have?
Klobuchar.
Is it Klobuchar? Okay, Klobuchar next year. Okay. But there's no,
they're not, they're not going to put up anyone serious against Klobuchar.
Right.
Who's just unbeatable here. But yeah, I mean, you're leaving out Jason Lewis, who's like this talk radio blowhard who kind of managed to win a House seat, luckily, but then he lost. So, he loses a House seat. Now he runs for states, he runs for U.S. Senate. You mentioned Jensen. I mean, he's coming out against vaccines when the vast majority of the state is vaccinated. I mean, we're a public health state. The largest private employer in the state is the Mayo Clinic. So that ethos of strong scientific institutions is strong here. And, he's, like you said, he's a quack family doctor out in the suburbs. And so he was just a terrible candidate. Kim Crockett is this kind of, hard right wing. I mean, they ran this video at their state Republican convention that had George Soros acting as like a puppeteer of Steve Simon, the Secretary of State, who's also Jewish. It was like just unbelievable, and the people of Minnesota I think that we like normal.
Yeah.
It was some normalcy.
Is there anybody on your radar in terms of Republicans who might, you mentioned Klobuchar, she routinely gets around like 60% in generals. She's not going to lose, but if it comes to Tina Smith's seats, when that's up, or, the next time Walz is on the ballot, I mean, are there any young Republicans who you think, people should kind of keep their eyes on as possible rising stars?
There's a guy in the state Senate, who I wrote about once, who went to Harvard and spent time at McKinsey, and he's like more the Republican that you can imagine winning here. But the problem is that just with the caucus process, it's just, again, it just favors people who are willing to hang out in some high school gymnasium for 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, and battle it out about who is the craziest, Trumpy, most insurrectionist person. And so they really need to fix that, go to statewide primaries. I mean, they do have the primary, but Republican voters tend to support whoever gets endorsed at the convention.
Right.
So they just need to appeal. I mean, what I wrote a column after the election saying, like, you need to go with the Republicans can potentially win here, but they have to go with like the Massachusetts, Maryland Republican governor route,
Yep.
where, a kind of pro-business but humane, socially moderate kind of guy or woman, probably woman, who can appeal to a wide variety and be seen as a balance against the progressive overreach in the legislature. I mean, that's the pitch, and you could do it. I mean, I think it is doable here, but they have no interest in that. They want to be crazy.
Yeah. And that's kind of a national problem as well, that these candidates who can get through the primaries are not the ones that can win in the general. And it seems to be kind of a systemic problem with the GOP these days. But wanted to ask you a kind of an exit question here just on journalism, because as I mentioned at the top, before you were at the Minnesota Reformer, you were at the Star Tribune as kind of one of their big Capitol reporters. Have you found it to be liberating to go from covering politics for a large, the largest newspaper in the state to kind of a strapping independent publication? How has that transition been for you?
I'm having a ball. I mean, this is the most fun I've ever had. I think that we have a little bit of that swagger of like the alt weeklies where we're used to work. And we just have fun kind of poking the bear and being really competitive and going after stories. I like the fact that we're free. We don't have paywalls. And so we're doing, I think, an important public service. I think it's good for the Star Tribune to have some competition to kind of sharpen their game. And we've been able to attract incredible reporters. In fact, this morning we just announced that we have someone starting in July, a young reporter with a lot of investigative experience, and Chris Ingram from the Washington Post has come to us. And so we're just extremely lucky. And I mean, I'm having so much fun. So I would encourage your listeners to check us out.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only is your content free, but I believe you also encourage people to repost it.
They can reshare it. Yeah. We encourage, in fact, I mean, that's part of our reason for being is that these especially outstate, but all kinds of publications are struggling, and we offer our Capitol coverage for free. They can republish it.
That's awesome. So yeah, just tell people as we wrap up here where they can find your work, if they want to follow you on social media, any plugs you want to work in here.
Yeah, I'm at JP Coolican on Twitter, and then we are MN Reformer on Twitter, and we are at MinnesotaReformer.com. We also have a daily newsletter, which people seem to really like. Most people open it, so that's a great place if you're a Minnesotan, or maybe you're a Minnesotan in exile. Sign up for our newsletter.
Yeah, and you can also pitch Patrick as well, because I know you guys you accept a lot of community pitches, and so if you want to write for the Reformer, you can do that too.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's been great, Aaron. Thanks.
That does it for today's episode of the Aaron Rupar Show. Please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and also follow me on YouTube to watch the footage of the show each week. You can find me there at the Aaron Rupar Show. New episodes drop every Wednesday, so be sure to check out your feeds each week for a new installment of the show, and thanks for listening.